The first distress beacon came through on a Tuesday, which Tomas Villanueva always thought was a ridiculous day for the end of the world to begin. He was elbow-deep in the guts of a recycler unit on Deck 7 when the alarm sounded. Not the klaxon, not the general quarters wail, but the soft, apologetic three-tone chime that the Colonial Welfare Bureau used for refugee signals. He'd heard it maybe twice in his 11 years working the processing station at Proxima Relay. Twice in 11 years. Now it was chiming like a metronome with a death wish, and it hadn't stopped for 4 minutes. He pulled his arm free, wiped the grease on his coveralls, and stood up to see Chief Administrator Reyes already running past the open bay door with a tablet clutched to her, chest and her hair coming loose from its braid. "Villanueva," she said without slowing down. "What is it? Get to the comms deck now." He followed her, still holding the socket wrench he'd been using on the recycler, because when Reyes said now, you didn't stop to put tools away. The comms deck of Proxima Relay Station was a modest room, 8 consoles, 2 windows that looked out on nothing but the gray nothing of deep transit space, and a central holographic display that was currently projecting a rotating star map with 17 blinking red markers scattered across it like drops of blood on a white tablecloth. 17. Each one was a distress signal. Specialist Ortega turned from her console when they entered. Her face had the particular stillness of someone who has already processed something terrible and is now waiting for everyone else to catch up. "It's the outer colonies," she said. 17 stations. The signals are all on the same subcarrier frequency, and they're all broadcasting the same encoded message. Reyes set her tablet down. "Play it." The message was 42 seconds long. The first 20 seconds were static and what sounded like impacts. Heavy, rhythmic, like something enormous walking on a metal floor. Then a voice. Human, female, exhausted, speaking in the clipped cadence of someone who had been trained to stay calm under pressure and was now using every fragment of that training to hold herself together. "This is Director Castellano of Outer Colony 7. We are under attack by non-human entities. I repeat, non-human. They came from the dark side of Kepler's moon. We don't know how long they've been there. We don't have a sound like tearing metal, very close. We don't have weapons sufficient to stop them. They are large. They are fast. They do not respond to any attempt at communication. They have already taken the Western residential block, and we cannot account for 312 colonists. I am transmitting our biometric data and whatever sensor recordings we managed to capture before our external arrays went down. I am requesting immediate military assistance from anyone who can hear this. All 17 stations on the Kepler band are transmitting simultaneously. If anyone, the static ate the next 4 words, please respond. We are not equipped for this. We are scientists and farmers and engineers. We are not soldiers. Please, someone respond." The message ended. The room was very quiet for a moment. Tomas Villanueva was still holding the socket wrench. "Has anyone responded?" Reyes asked. Ortega shook her head. "The Federated Worlds Council has the signal. The Hegemony patrol fleets have the signal. The United Frontier Defense Initiative has the signal." She paused. "None of them have responded. Why not?" "Because all 17 stations are in the Kepler band." Ortega pulled up the star map and expanded the relevant sector. "Outside the treaty zones. Technically outside anyone's jurisdiction. The Council is calling an emergency session to determine which governing body has legal authority to. An emergency session." Reyes's voice was perfectly flat. "Yes, Administrator. How many people are on those 17 stations?" "Combined registered population is approximately 41,800. Reyes looked at the blinking red markers for a long moment. Then she looked at Villanueva. He wasn't sure why she looked at him specifically. Maybe because he was the only other person in the room who wasn't a comms specialist. And his face was probably the least professionally composed. "What do we do?" he asked, even though he wasn't sure he was supposed to be asking questions. "We respond," she said. "We're a processing station. We have a cargo bay, 3 shuttlecraft, and a crew of 49. But we're the closest inhabited installation to the Kepler band, and the law can figure out the jurisdictional question while we're already moving." She picked up her tablet. "Ortega, get me a channel to every station that's still broadcasting." "Villanueva, you know everyone on the station, right? Personally? Most of them. Yeah. Go tell them what's happening. Don't sugarcoat it. Ask for volunteers." He stared at her. "Volunteers for what exactly?" "For going into whatever this is and getting those people out." He thought about the sound of that voice, the exhaustion in it, the way the woman had said please as the static closed over her like water. "How many do you need?" he asked. "Everyone who's willing." He went. His name was not originally Tomas Villanueva. It had been Tomas Acuna Villanueva. But when he was 7 years old, his father had packed everything the family owned into 2 bags and said they were going somewhere better, and the transit documents at the processing port had an error, and somehow the Acuna had fallen off and nobody had ever gotten around to fixing it. He'd grown up as Villanueva, and by the time he was old enough to care about names, he'd decided that a man could either spend his energy mourning what got left behind or spend it dealing with what was in front of him. He chose the second option most of the time. It was easier. He was 34 years old, with the kind of hands that belonged to someone who fixed things for a living, calloused, scarred, permanently marked with grease no matter how carefully he scrubbed them. He had a face that people tended to trust, which he suspected was because it was the face of someone who looked perpetually, mildly confused by the world but was too stubborn to stop engaging with it. He wasn't especially brave. He wasn't especially strong. He was good at understanding how machines worked, and he was good at talking to people, and he had a particular quality that those who knew him well described as a kind of cheerful, infuriating refusal to accept that a situation was hopeless until it actually was. He'd grown up in a transit community, one of those mid-space settlements that weren't quite a station and weren't quite a ship, just a cluster of habitation modules that had been docked together long enough that people started calling it home. His mother had been a water systems technician, and she used to hum while she worked, low and tuneless and rhythmic, the same way the station's ventilation ducts hummed at night. He'd inherited the habit without realizing it. People who worked near him had noticed, over the years, that when Villanueva got quiet and focused and started humming, it usually meant he'd found the problem and was already working on the solution, and the best thing to do was stay out of his way and let him finish. He'd discovered, over the course of the next 6 hours, that 41 of the station's 49 crew members were willing to go. The 8 who weren't were 3 people with children on other stations who felt they couldn't risk it, 2 with medical conditions that would complicate emergency operations, 1 who was simply and honestly terrified and said so plainly without apology, 1 who said it wasn't their problem, and 1 elderly navigation specialist named Garza who was so deaf he hadn't entirely understood what was being asked and agreed by accident, then declined politely once someone wrote it down for him. The 41 who said yes included a food services manager who'd done 2 years of planetary militia training 20 years ago, a water systems engineer who was the station's unofficial arm wrestling champion, 2 doctors, a supply chain administrator who'd never held a weapon in her life but said she'd figure it out, and a very small, very precise woman named Esperanza who maintained the station's drone fleet and had, in Villanueva's opinion, the most comprehensive and creative vocabulary of profanity in 3 languages that he had ever encountered. They were not soldiers. They were, as Director Castellano had said about her own people, scientists and farmers and engineers. The difference was that they had decided, without anyone ordering them to, without any governing body granting them authority, and without any particular plan beyond get there and help, that 41,800 people were worth the risk. It was not a rational calculation. Villanueva understood that. He'd done the math on the shuttle ride, and the math did not favor them. But there was something about the way that voice had said, please, that made the math feel beside the point. He sat in the back of the shuttle on the transit to Station 7 and did not hum. He was not yet at the stage of finding the solution. He was at the stage of sitting with the problem, which was a necessary stage that he had always found deeply uncomfortable and which he'd never figured out how to skip. Pacheco, the water systems engineer, sat across from him and passed him a flask. "Calms the hands," Pacheco said, by way of explanation. He was a big man with a gentle face and the kind of permanent squint that came from spending years checking pressure gauges in poor lighting. Villanueva took the flask and drank. Whatever was in it was warm and sharp and tasted like something that had been distilled in a container that probably hadn't been designed for distilling. "Is this good?" he asked. "No," Pacheco said tearfully, "but it's available." Villanueva handed it back. Esperanza, sitting on Pacheco's right, took it without being offered and drank without comment. "What do you think they are?" Pacheco asked. He wasn't asking anyone specific. He was asking the shuttle, or the transit space outside it, or the general concept of the universe. "Something that hadn't been there before," Esperanza said. She had her tablet out and was studying the sensor data they'd collected from Station 7's last transmissions. The signal patterns are structured, not random interference. They're doing something to the external arrays. "How do you know that?" "Because random interference looks like noise, and this looks like someone playing an instrument they've never held before." She turned the tablet toward him briefly. "See the frequency cycling? Regular interval. Consistent amplitude variation. Whatever is generating this is trying to communicate a pattern. They just don't know what pattern will work. They're trying everything." Villanueva looked at the display for a moment before Esperanza turned it back. "That's an interesting way to look at it," he said. "I work with drones," she said. "When a drone has a communication fault, it tries every protocol in its library before it fails. That's what this looks like." She paused. "Except a drone's library is finite. Whatever is generating these patterns has been doing it for 40 hours and they haven't repeated yet." That sat in the shuttle for a while. Nobody said anything. "A very large library," Pacheco said finally. "A very large library," Esperanza agreed. The Kepler band was a stretch of space that looked, from the outside, like nothing special. Gray transit space, the kind that swallowed light and returned nothing. 17 colonial stations arranged in a loose arc, each one a small community of people who had chosen to build something in the middle of nowhere, because nowhere was, in certain important respects, better than the somethings they'd left behind. They reached Station 7 first because it was the closest, and because Director Castellano's voice was still in Villanueva's head. The external sensors on Station 7 were dark. No beacon responses, no docking signals, no electronic handshake of any kind. The station sat in the dark like a tooth that had fallen out of a mouth, still intact in its basic shape, clearly designed for human habitation, but something about it was wrong in a way that Villanueva felt before he could name it. Reyes matched velocity from a distance, and they ran scans for 4 minutes before she said quietly, "There are life signs." "How many?" "Difficult to say. The interference is significant." She frowned at her display. "Something inside that station is producing electromagnetic distortion that's messing with our instruments. But there are thermal signatures. Humans emit heat, and some of that's getting through the noise." "And the other signatures?" asked Dr. Medina from the back of the command deck. She was one of the two doctors. She'd been standing very still for the last 4 minutes with her hands clasped in front of her, like she was waiting for a test result. "Yes," Reyes said. "There are other signatures." Nobody asked what other meant exactly, because the sensor display was rotating, and even through the distortion, even on the limited resolution of their second-hand equipment, it was clear that whatever was moving through Station 7's corridors was not built on a human scale. There were 6 of them, as best they could determine. They were large. The sensors suggested something in the range of 8 to 10 feet of upright mass, though the distortion made precise measurement impossible. They moved in groups of 2 or 3, slowly, methodically, as though they were searching, or counting, or doing something for which there wasn't a good human word. "They're in the residential section," Ortega said. "The thermal signatures cluster there. I think the colonists have barricaded themselves into the medical wing. It's the most defensible part of the station." She pulled up the station's layout schematic from the Colonial Registry. "Single access corridor, reinforced blast doors. They've probably been holding there since the attack." "How long has that been?" "Based on the first distress signal, probably 14 hours. 14 hours. Villanueva looked at the schematic. He thought about being locked in a room for 14 hours with something enormous moving through the corridors outside, not knowing if the door would hold, not knowing if anyone was coming. Someone had better be coming. "How do we dock without alerting them?" he asked. Esperanza, who had been studying the station schematic for the last 20 minutes, with the focused intensity she usually brought to drone calibration, spoke without looking up. "Emergency maintenance port, starboard midship. It's not a standard docking collar, but I can modify the interface. It'll take me about 8 minutes, and it bypasses the main docking systems entirely. No electronic signature, no automated announcement, nothing that would register on internal sensors." "You can do that?" She looked up at him. "I maintain the drone fleet on a station that hasn't received a parts shipment in 6 months. I can do anything with cable ties and a bad attitude." He smiled despite everything. 8 minutes, okay. "The other problem," said Ortega, "is that we don't know what these things are. We don't know if they communicate, if they have command structure, if there are more of them somewhere we can't see. We don't know what they want." "Director Castellano said they didn't respond to communication attempts," Villanueva said. "That doesn't mean they can't communicate. It might mean they didn't want to." The room sat with that for a moment. "We go anyway," Reyes said. "It wasn't a question. We dock. We move to the medical wing. We get the people out. We worry about what the things are after the people are safe." It was, Villanueva thought, not the most sophisticated tactical plan he'd ever heard. But then, nobody in the room had sophisticated tactical training, so it would have to do. The maintenance port was tight, cold, and smelled like burned insulation. Esperanza worked on the interface coupling in the dark with a headlamp and a set of tools that she'd modified herself over the years until they were less tools and more extensions of her own hands. 7 minutes and 50 seconds after she'd started, the port sealed with a soft magnetic thunk, and she turned and gave a thumbs up that was somehow both casual and triumphant. They moved through the maintenance tunnels in pairs, following the schematic on their tablets. Villanueva was with Esperanza. Behind them came Medina and her colleague Dr. Fuentes, then 6 of the strongest people on the station crew. The water systems engineer Pacheco, who was carrying a plasma cutter repurposed from the fabrication bay, and 5 others with various combinations of construction tools and personal conviction. The maintenance tunnels were too small for whatever was moving through the main corridors. That was the first piece of luck. The second was that Station 7's maintenance system operated on a separate grid from the primary lighting, so they had light in the tunnels even though the main corridors were dark. The third piece of luck was that Esperanza, moving soundlessly in her worn magnetic boots, heard the thing in Junction 7C before it heard them. She stopped, held up a fist. Everyone stopped. Through the thin maintenance panel, they could hear something breathing. It was not a human sound. It was slow and large and rhythmic, like tide coming in, and it was accompanied by a smell, organic, heavy, something between iron and wet soil, that seeped through the panel seams and made Villanueva's eyes water. He'd smelled a lot of things in 11 years of maintenance work. Machine oil and solder, and the particular dry burn of recycled air and the sharp mineral bite of tank cleaners. He'd built an entire mental library of smells over the years, because smells told you things about what was happening in a system before you could see it. This smell told him nothing. He had no file for it. It was something entirely outside the library, and the absence of reference was more frightening in its way than any specific threat would have been. He looked at the schematic. Junction 7C connected the maintenance tunnel to the residential level. They needed to get past it. Esperanza held up her tablet, typed 2 words, "Alternate route?" He studied the schematic. There was one. It added 11 minutes and required crossing through the water reclamation bay, but it would keep them well clear of 7C. He nodded. They went around. The water reclamation bay was lit by emergency phosphorescence in pale green, and it was here, stepping carefully around the processing tanks, that Villanueva first got a proper look at what they were dealing with. One of them was standing at the far end of the bay. It had its back to them. It was tall enough that it had to angle its head to avoid the ceiling supports, and it was broad in a way that made Villanueva's mind refuse, briefly, to process the shape as a single organism. Its back was armored, not in the sense of manufactured armor, but biologically, a natural carapace of overlapping chitin-like plates that caught the green emergency light in shifting patterns of deep blue and iridescent purple. Its limbs were numerous. He counted 6, though the rearmost 2 seemed vestigial, held tight against the body, and the forward 4 moved with slow, deliberate purpose as it examined the water processing equipment. It was touching the equipment, carefully, almost tenderly. It did not seem to notice them. Villanueva very slowly, very quietly gestured, "Back, stay low, don't run." They retreated 1 meter, 2, 3. The thing continued its examination of the processing equipment unhurried. One forward limb trailed along the side of the main processing tank, and for a moment Villanueva had the strange impression that it was reading the tank by touch, interpreting its dimensions, its material composition, the function it served. He had no basis for that interpretation. It was the kind of thing his brain produced when confronted with something it couldn't categorize, filling the gap with the closest available frame. But the impression didn't go away. 10 meters back, around the corner, Doctor. Medina grabbed Villanueva's arm and pressed her mouth close to his ear. "It was studying it," she whispered. "The equipment. It was studying our equipment." He thought about what Ortega had said. That doesn't mean they can't communicate. It might mean they didn't want to. And now, they were examining the station's infrastructure, not destroying it, examining it. He filed that observation away and kept moving. The medical wing blast doors were exactly where the schematic said they'd be, at the end of a long corridor that connected to the maintenance tunnel via a service hatch. The hatch was sealed from the inside, which meant the people inside had found it and fortified it, which meant they were still thinking clearly enough to do that, which was good. Villanueva knocked on the hatch in a pattern. 3 short, 2 long, 3 short, arbitrary but human. Something built from habit and rhythm that couldn't be mistaken for the slow, enormous movement they'd been hearing through the walls. Silence for a moment. Then, from the other side, very faint, "Who's there?" "My name is Tomas Villanueva," he said quietly, lips nearly against the hatch. "I work at Proxima Relay Station. We picked up your distress signal. We're here. Can you open this?" A pause, longer than comfortable. Then the sound of something heavy being moved, and a manual release mechanism grinding, and the hatch opened. The face on the other side was a woman's. Mid-40s, dark circles under her eyes, a cut above her eyebrow that had been neatly bandaged, Hair pulled back with a strip of medical tape because she'd apparently lost her hair tie at some point during the last 14 hours, and improvised with what was available. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been holding themselves together through will alone and is suddenly dangerously close to being allowed to stop. "Director Castellano?" he asked. Her voice was the same voice he'd heard in the recording, but less composed, not because she was less capable, but because she was more human now that there was someone else in front of her to be human with. "How many people do you have?" 41. "We have 3 shuttles. We can take everyone. There are 218 people in here." She stepped back to let them in. 312 colonists are still unaccounted for. They were in the western residential block when, "We know." He stepped through the hatch. Behind him came Medina and Fuentes and the others. "We know. We'll come back for them." She looked at him. It was the kind of look that asked, without asking out loud, whether that was a promise or a wish. "We'll come back," he said again. And he meant it with enough specificity that she nodded and began organizing. Inside the medical wing, 218 people occupied a space designed for perhaps 40 at a time. They had organized themselves with remarkable efficiency. Children and the injured in the actual medical bays, everyone else distributed through the corridors and storage rooms in a way that kept the blast doors clear and maintained access to the few supplies they'd been able to gather before sealing themselves in. There were buckets of water, there were first aid kits, there was, on a counter in the main medical bay, a single bottle of something amber-colored and unlabeled that 3 people were sharing with the quiet seriousness of communion. He recognized the organizing principle immediately. These were people who didn't know if help was coming, and so they'd built the most survivable version of their situation that they could, because humans, in Villanueva's experience, would do that. They would structure themselves, assign roles, share resources, take care of the children first. They would do this even when they were terrified, maybe especially when they were terrified. Give a human a problem they can't solve, and they will find the smallest version of it they can act on, and they will act on it, and they will keep acting on it. And sometimes the accumulated weight of all those small actions is enough to hold the world together until something bigger can get there. The amber bottle and the quiet communion of it was, somehow, the most human thing he'd seen in days. "We need to move," Medina said. She'd taken one look at the situation and immediately started assessing the injured. "Some of these people need surgery. How fast can we get them to the shuttles?" "Maintenance tunnels back to the port. Maybe 15 minutes if we move steadily. The problem is we need to avoid the junction where we heard one of them. So it's the long way through water reclamation." "That's 25 minutes, said Castellano, who had apparently memorized the station's maintenance schematics. "Yes. Unless," he looked at Esperanza. Esperanza, who had been studying something on her tablet with narrowed eyes, looked up. "Junction 7C. One of them is there. Can you get around it?" "I can do better than that," she said. "If I reroute the station's waste processing flush through the junction, timed right, I can clear whatever s there for about 4 minutes." "You want to wash it out with waste?" She shrugged. "It's water, mostly water, and it'll be loud and confusing, and in my experience, loud and confusing buys time." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I know if it'll hurt them. We don't know what they are, but it'll move them." Castellano said the processing flush controls are in the maintenance substation on level 3. "I can get there. I know this station." "You shouldn't go alone," Villanueva said. "Then come with me," she said, and she was already moving. Level 3 was 2 maintenance tunnels and 1 ventilation crawl space away from the medical wing. Castellano moved through it with the ease of someone who'd lived on this station for 6 years and knew its bones the way you know the layout of your own home in the dark. Villanueva followed, and he was struck, watching her move, the efficiency of it, the lack of wasted motion, by what it must have been to spend 14 hours listening to something enormous moving through your station and not knowing what it wanted, and not being able to stop it, and not knowing if anyone was coming. "How many signals did you send before we responded?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "We broadcast for 12 hours before you responded. 17 stations broadcasting simultaneously." She didn't say it as an accusation. It was just information stated plainly. "The governing bodies had a lot to discuss. I know. I'm sorry. You came," she said. "That's the thing that matters." He thought about the 8 people on his station who hadn't volunteered. He wasn't angry at them. He understood every one of their reasons. But he was glad he was here, in this ventilation crawl space, following a woman who'd held 218 people together for 14 hours, rather than back at Proxima Relay waiting for the emergency session to conclude. The maintenance substation was a small room full of pipe interfaces and control panels that looked, to an untrained eye, like organized chaos. To Castellano, it was apparently as readable as a breakfast menu. She went straight to the flush controls, studied the panel for a moment, and said, "I'll need 3 minutes to set up the time sequence. Can you watch the access corridor?" Yes. He stood at the junction of the access corridor and watched the dark. And for the first time since they'd boarded the station, he was entirely alone with his fear. It had been there the whole time. He wasn't going to pretend it hadn't. Living just behind his ribcage, a constant low-level pressure. He'd been managing it by staying in motion, by having the next task immediately in front of him. Standing still in the dark, it had room to expand. He breathed through it. His mother's hum was somewhere in the back of his head, tuneless and rhythmic, and without deciding to, he was doing it quietly, just enough vibration in his throat to feel it. Something moved at the far end of the corridor, not close, 40 meters maybe. He could see it only because the emergency phosphorescence caught the edge of its carapace plating, a slick, shifting gleam, like oil on water. It was moving slowly, that same methodical pace he'd seen in the reclamation bay, and it hadn't registered him yet. He stood very still. He kept breathing. He did not stop the hum because stopping it suddenly felt, for reasons he couldn't justify, like the wrong move, like a noise rather than a silence. The thing moved along the far wall, trailing one of its forward limbs along the corridor surface, feeling the material, exploring. It paused at a data panel, and he watched it. He could not help watching it, as it ran what he thought of as a finger along the edge of the panel housing. Not destroying, not breaking, reading. A thought arrived in his mind, quiet and strange and insistent. It's learning about this place. He didn't know where the thought came from. He didn't know if it was right. But it sat in him with the particular weight of things that are true before you understand why they're true. "Done," Castellano said very quietly, from behind him. He glanced back. She was at his shoulder. On the panel behind her, a sequence of lights was cycling through its count. "How long?" 4 minutes. Junction 7C. Will flood on my mark. Mark. She pressed the control. They did not hear the flush from where they were. It was too far away, but they heard the response to it. A sound they couldn't categorize. Deep, resonant, layered, like several instruments playing a chord that human ears weren't designed to process. It came from the direction of 7C, and from somewhere above them, and Villanueva thought, from somewhere in his chest, a vibration more than a sound, the kind that you feel in the bones of your sternum before your ears have time to register it. It was not a sound of pain or anger or alarm, at least not any version of those things he recognized. It was something more complex, something that might have had 20 meanings or none. "Move," said Castellano. They moved, back through the ventilation crawl, back through the maintenance tunnels, back to the medical wing where Esperanza was already organizing the evacuation with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd spent a decade making complex things happen in small spaces with inadequate equipment. 7C is clear, Villanueva said. We have maybe 3 minutes before whatever we displaced comes back. We don't need 3 minutes, Esperanza said. We need 2. She had, in the time they'd been gone, organized the 218 people into 3 groups, assigned each group a runner who knew the maintenance tunnel route, designated 3 people to carry the most severely injured, and apparently explained the situation to the children in terms clear enough that even the youngest ones were moving quietly, purposefully, without panic. He would never know exactly what she'd said to them. She declined when he asked later to repeat it, saying only that children were easier than adults because they hadn't yet learned to freeze. He didn't argue with that. They moved. The evacuation through the maintenance tunnels took 2 minutes and 40 seconds. It felt much longer. Villanueva was at the rear, and he spent most of those 2 minutes and 40 seconds listening for the sound of large movement in the tunnels behind them, and hearing, instead, only the soft footsteps of 218 human beings trying very hard to be quiet. He'd heard groups of people in distress before, evacuations from equipment failures, medical emergencies, the occasional structural warning that required clearing a residential block. He knew the particular sonic texture of people who were afraid and moving together. This was different. This was 218 people who had been holding themselves in silence for 14 hours, who had made silence into a survival tool, and who now moved through the tunnels with the practiced quiet of people who had learned in the worst possible classroom. They reached the maintenance port without incident. The 3 shuttles held 70 people each, which was technically an overload by about 30%. But Dr. Fuentes had already calculated that the overload was survivable for a 1-hour transit to Proxima relay, and had said so with the particular authority of someone who's had to redefine survival more than once in their career. Villanueva stood at the port and counted people through. It was the kind of task that should have been automated, but the station systems were down and someone had to do it. And this was the kind of someone has to do it job that he'd been doing his entire adult life. He counted. He kept moving. He helped a woman with a broken arm through the hatch, steadied an elderly man who stumbled, accepted a small child from someone's arms, and passed it through to waiting hands on the other side. 187, 188. Helped the 193rd person through when the thing appeared at the far end of the maintenance corridor. It was not the same one he'd seen in the water reclamation bay or in the level 3 corridor. Or perhaps it was, he had no way of knowing. What he knew was that it was standing at the end of the corridor, 25 meters away, illuminated by the headlamps of the people who hadn't made it through the port yet, and that it was very still. It was looking at them. He would not have been able to explain after how he knew it was looking at them rather than simply facing in their direction. But he knew. The quality of its attention was different from the unfocused exploration he'd seen before. It was focused, and it was on them. "Keep moving," he said quietly. "Don't stop. Don't look at it. Keep moving." The remaining 25 people moved. The thing watched. It did not advance. He kept counting. 198, 199. The corridor was thinning, the line shortening, and the thing at the end of it had not moved in 40 seconds. And he was beginning to allow himself the thought that maybe it wasn't going to 211, 212. A child, maybe 8 years old, stopped in front of him. She turned around. She was looking at the thing at the end of the corridor with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite curiosity, but something balanced between them. The expression of a child who has not yet learned which one to default to. "Hey," he said softly, "this way." "It has too many legs," she said. "I know. Come on. Is it going to follow us?" He looked at the thing. It had moved very slightly, not forward, but to the side as if adjusting its viewing angle, as if getting a better look. "I don't know," he said, because she was 8 years old, and the honest answer was better than the comfortable one. "But we're not going to find out right now, okay? We're going to go through this door." He held out his hand. She took it. They went through. 213, 214. The last of the colonists were through. Castellino was second to last. She looked back at the thing in the corridor as she stepped through the hatch, and it looked back at her, and something passed between them. Some exchange of information that Villanueva couldn't translate but could feel the edges of. It was not a threat. It was not a farewell. It was something else. Something that didn't have a human word. 217. 218. He was the last one through. He sealed the hatch, engaged the emergency locks, and had approximately 6 seconds to feel the full weight of the last 3 hours before Esperanza grabbed his arm and said, "We're undocking in 90 seconds and you need to strap in." He strapped in. The 3 shuttles separated from Station 7 without incident. No pursuit. No signal. Nothing from the station at all except the same electromagnetic distortion they'd detected on approach. On the 60-minute transit back to Proxima Relay, Villanueva sat on the floor of the 3rd shuttle. There were no empty seats. He'd given his to a man with a leg injury and ate half a nutrition bar that someone pressed into his hand and thought about what he'd seen. Not the thing in the water reclamation bay. Not the one in the level 3 corridor. Not the one at the end of the maintenance tunnel, watching them go. He thought about the girl, 8 years old. Is it going to follow us? He thought about the way the thing had moved to adjust its viewing angle, getting a better look. He thought about his original observation, standing in the dark corridor. It's learning about this place. He took out his tablet and opened a new document and started writing down everything he'd observed in order, with timestamps as best he could reconstruct them. Not because anyone had asked him to. Not because he had any particular training in threat assessment or xenobiology or any of the other disciplines that would normally apply to what he'd just experienced, but because he was a man who fixed things for a living, and the first step in fixing something was understanding how it worked, and the only way to start understanding something was to write down what you knew. He wrote for 40 minutes. When he looked up, Castellano was sitting across from him, her own tablet out, her hair still held back by that strip of medical tape. "You're taking notes," she said. "Habit." "What I noticed?" About them," he hesitated. "They weren't destroying infrastructure. They were examining it. The equipment in the water reclamation bay, the data panel in the level 3 corridor, they were being careful with it." She was quiet for a moment. "I noticed that too. In the first hours before we sealed the medical wing." She turned her tablet around. "I have footage. Our internal sensors were still running when the external arrays went dark. I have 11 minutes of footage from before we sealed in. The footage was grainy and intermittently distorted, but it was there. 4 of the creatures, moving through the western residential block. Not hunting, not destroying. Moving through the spaces where the colonists had been living their lives. Through the common rooms, the small personal quarters, the shared kitchen, and touching things. Picking things up carefully, examining them, setting them down. Picking up a child's drawing that had been pinned to a wall. Looking at it for 23 seconds, then replacing it carefully. Picking up a coffee mug, turning it in what might have been hands, putting it down. Where did the 312 go? Villanueva asked. Castellano was quiet for a long time. We don't know, she said at last. When we sealed the medical wing, they were all ready. When we sealed in, we couldn't account for them. The sensors in the western block went dark at the same time. But there were he stopped. No bodies, she said. No blood. No signs of violence anywhere in the footage we have. She looked at her tablet. They're somewhere. I don't know where. But they're somewhere. He thought about that for the remaining 20 minutes of transit. He thought about it while they docked at Proxima Relay and the colonists filed off the shuttles into the station's loading bay, where Reyes had set up cots and emergency rations and a space that was warm and dry and free of things that watched you from the end of corridors. He thought about it while the children were taken to what had been the break room and given food and, in the case of the 8-year-old, a worn stuffed animal that Ortega had produced from somewhere and offered without comment. The girl accepted it with the gravity of someone receiving a useful tool rather than a comfort object, which Villanueva found, inexplicably, one of the most heartening things he'd seen all day. He thought about 312 people who weren't dead but weren't here. And then, because standing still was not something he did well, when there was a problem in front of him, he went to find Reyes. We're going back, he said. Reyes looked at him across her desk. She'd had perhaps 3 hours of sleep in the last 36. There were lines on her face that hadn't been there before. Or maybe they'd always been there, and she'd just been moving too fast for him to notice them. The other 16 stations, he said. Their distress signals are still broadcasting. There are people still out there. And the 312 from Station 7, Villanueva, we have one station with 49 people and 3 shuttles. 41 now, he said. Since 41 of them went the first time. He paused. 41 people went the first time because 41 people decided to go. If we put out a signal, our own signal, not a distress call, an actual call for volunteers, there are other processing stations, cargo haulers, independent operators in the transit lanes, it's not our jurisdiction. He looked at her. Whose jurisdiction is it? She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling, exhaled, and said, how long to build a broadcast strong enough to reach the transit lanes? Ortega says 6 hours. Build it, she said. But Villanueva. She looked at him again. What we're going into now is different from what we went into before. Before, we were extracting people. Now we're going back into stations that have been occupied by whatever they are, for over 40 hours. We don't know what's changed. We don't know what we'll find. No, he agreed. We don't, and you still want to go. I want to find 312 people who should be somewhere. She nodded. One single small nod. 6 hours. He used part of those 6 hours to sleep. Not because he wanted to, but because he'd learned over the years that the machine doesn't run well without maintenance. And he was, in some fundamental sense, the kind of person who thought of himself as a machine that needed maintaining. He slept on a cot in the station's secondary storage room, 4 hours of something dense and dreamless, and woke up with the socket wrench still in his pocket and a clarity of mind that felt, after the blur of the last 36 hours, like a gift. He spent the remaining time eating, which Esperanza made him do by putting food in front of him with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who understood that you couldn't run a precision instrument on an empty tank. He ate without tasting it and went over his notes and added 3 observations he'd missed on the first pass. The broadcast went out at ZO 600 station time. This is Proxima Relay Station. We have completed an extraction of 218 survivors from Colony Station 7 in the Kepler band, and we are preparing a second mission to the remaining 16 stations. We are not a military installation. We are not authorized by any governing body. We have 3 shuttles and 41 crew members who want to help. If you are in the transit lanes and you hear this and you want to help, we are asking you to come. No credentials required, no authorization required, just come. He didn't write the broadcast, Ortega did. It was better than anything he would have written, and he told her so. And she looked pleased in the way that people who rarely receive compliments looked pleased, slightly uncertain, as though checking that the good thing was real. By 1,000, 8 vessels had responded. Not military, not officially authorized, a colony supply hauler with a crew of 12. Two independent cargo operators who happened to be carrying relatively little and therefore had capacity. A scientific survey ship that had been in the process of completing a completely unrelated mission and had, according to its captain, decided the unrelated mission could wait. A small passenger ferry with 68 empty seats. Three other processing or relay stations within reasonable distance who had heard the original distress signals and were apparently waiting for someone else to move first and had now decided that someone else was going to be them. When all 8 vessels had checked in and reported capacity, the total was 312 volunteers. The number was, Villanueva noticed, the same as the number of missing colonists from Station 7, which was the kind of coincidence that meant nothing practically and felt meaningful anyway. He was not a superstitious man, but he noticed it. Reyes coordinated the fleet assignment with an efficiency that suggested she'd been planning this while pretending to herself that she wasn't. Each vessel was assigned a station, with the larger ships taking the stations where the distress signals were strongest, indicating more survivors or more acute situations. Villanueva's shuttle was assigned to the station with the weakest signal, Station 14. Why? He asked Reyes. Because a weak signal could mean the fewest survivors. She paused. Or it could mean the signal is being blocked, and I want someone who pays close attention in there. He thought about writing in his tablet, on the shuttle floor, about the notes he'd taken, about the 8-year-old girl's question, about the thing at the end of the corridor, moving sideways to adjust its viewing angle. I pay close attention, he confirmed. He took Esperanza with him, and Castellano, who had, when asked if she wanted to stay at Proxima Relay with the other rescued colonists, looked at him as though the question were faintly offensive, and Pacheco with his plasma cutter, and 7 others. 11 people, 1 shuttle, 1 station with a weak signal and an unknown number of people inside. Station 14 was different. The electromagnetic distortion was there, as it had been at Station 7, but it was thicker. A visible shimmer at the edges of their sensor displays that made him think, irrationally, of heat haze. The station's external lighting was on, which Station 7's hadn't been, and the external arrays were active, not broadcasting a distress signal, not sending any coherent transmission, but active. Something is running those arrays, Ortega's voice said from the relay channel. I'm reading deliberate frequency cycling, not random interference, pattern. What kind of pattern? A pause. I don't know yet. Trying to analyze. Esperanza, looking at her own display, said it's like what I described on the transit to 7. Every protocol in the library. Except this time the library is much bigger, and they're cycling through it faster. She looked at Villanueva. They've been at 17 stations for 40-plus hours. They've had 40 hours to learn what doesn't work. He thought about that. He thought about a drone running through communication protocols after a fault. He thought about the difference between 40 hours of random noise and 40 hours of systematic elimination. They're getting closer to something that will work, he said. That's what I think, Esperanza said. They docked the conventional way this time, the standard collar, the automated handshake, because the external systems were active and because Villanueva had made a decision in the last 6 hours of planning that he was going to act on the thing he'd observed rather than against it. They were examining this place. They were learning about it. He was going to let them. He cycled the airlock and stepped onto the docking arm and waited. Castellano was beside him. Behind them, 11 people with tools and quiet determination. The station corridor beyond the docking arm was lit, dim but lit, and it was not empty. One of them was standing in the corridor, alone, at a distance he could manage, not pressing, not advancing, not displaying any of the behaviors that a threat assessment would flag as aggressive. It had apparently met them at the door. He stood in the docking arm and looked at it, and it stood in the corridor and looked at him, and he was aware of his heart doing something rapid and involuntary, and he let it, because fear was appropriate here, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He let it happen, and he breathed through it, and underneath the fear, underneath the rapid involuntary machinery of survival instinct, there was something else, the same focused, methodical attention he brought to a broken recycler unit. Assessment, observation. What do I know? What does it tell me? He looked at the thing in the corridor. It had positioned itself exactly far enough away to be visible without being threatening. That was either coincidence or intention, and coincidence seemed unlikely. Then he did something that he would later be entirely unable to explain to anyone who asked, because it wasn't protocol and it wasn't tactical, and it wasn't anything that any training would have produced. He reached into his coverall pocket, took out the half-finished nutrition bar he'd put there and forgotten about, and held it up. He had no idea if that meant anything to them. He had no idea if they had a concept of food sharing, or gestures of non-threat or offering. He had no idea if they had any concept that translated to any of that. But he was a man whose instinct, when uncertain, was to lead with something small and genuinely intended, and holding out a nutrition bar was small and in its way genuine. The thing in the corridor looked at the nutrition bar for 6 seconds. Then it stepped to the side of the corridor, leaving the path clear, and made a gesture with one of its forward limbs, slow, deliberate downward, that could have meant a dozen things and probably meant something he didn't have words for but felt in his body like, "Go ahead." He walked forward. The others followed. Station 14's population was 347 people, and they were in the commissary, not barricaded, not locked in. Sitting at the commissary tables, in the large open space where the station community gathered for meals, arranged not in the tight, defensive clustering of the medical wing on Station 7, but in something more like, he struggled to describe it, even to himself, deliberate gathering. They were sitting at tables in groups, and at each table, 1 or 2 or 3 of the creatures sat or crouched or positioned themselves in ways that their body structure made necessary, and the people and the creatures were looking at each other across the surfaces of commissary tables. Not communicating, not yet, but they were in the same space, and nobody was bleeding, and the children were eating food from the commissary dispensers, and one elderly man in the corner appeared to be showing one of the creatures how to work a coffee machine with the patient persistence of someone who has explained coffee machines to many people who didn't understand them and has made peace with the process. Villanueva stopped in the commissary entrance and stared. A woman his age, with a station administrator's badge and an expression of careful, exhausted concentration, came to meet him. "Administrator Vega," she said, "we sent the distress signal. I need to be honest with you, mostly because we weren't sure what else to do. The situation has been evolving." She looked back at the room. "In the first hours, yes, it was what the other stations reported. They came in, they moved through the station, the residents were frightened, and so were we. But they didn't attack, they didn't destroy anything. They examined everything, and eventually," she paused, "eventually it became clear that they were waiting for something, or looking for something. What, we're not sure. But about 6 hours ago, one of our communications engineers, Specialist Ruiz, had an idea." She nodded toward a young man sitting at a table with 2 of the creatures. He was showing them something on a tablet, a communication interface, Villanueva realized, with frequency visualizers running. He started playing back the signal patterns they were generating through our external arrays. At them, just repeating it back. And one of the creatures at Ruiz's table made a sound. The layered, resonant chord he'd heard at Station 7, but shorter, more structured. Ruiz looked at his tablet, made an adjustment, played something back. The creature made the sound again. Different. "They're working on a language," Administrator Vega said. "Ruiz says it's going to take a long time. Probably longer than either of them has patience for. But they're working on it." Villanueva looked at the room, at the people and the enormous alien creatures sitting across commissary tables from each other, in the dim light of a station at the edge of mapped space, at the elderly man who was apparently committed to teaching someone from beyond the stars how to operate a coffee machine, at the children eating, at Ruiz, young and focused and vibrating with the particular energy of someone who has found a problem exactly large enough to be worth their complete attention. He thought about the thing at the end of the maintenance tunnel, on Station 7, that had watched them leave, getting a better look. He pulled up his tablet and went to find a seat at Ruiz's table. The work of the next 8 hours was the hardest kind of work. The kind where you don't know the tools, you don't know the language, you're not sure you're making progress or just making noise, and you have to keep going anyway, because the alternative is to not know, and not knowing is worse than the effort. Ruiz was 23 years old and had a theory and a tablet, and the kind of methodical patience that belonged either to very good scientists or very good engineers, and Villanueva suspected he was going to become one or the other before this was over. He'd built a frequency mapping tool from the station's communication equipment, basic, rough, not even close to adequate, but there, and he was using it to map the sounds the creatures made against the patterns they'd been broadcasting on the external arrays. Villanueva sat with him for 3 hours and learned how to operate the interface, and then took over a section of the analysis so Ruiz could sleep for 90 minutes because the young man had been awake for over 30 hours and his hands were shaking, and there was no point having a precision instrument if the precision instrument was too exhausted to function. While Ruiz slept, Villanueva worked, and while he worked, one of the creatures from the adjacent table moved, slowly, carefully, making no sound above its natural low breath, and positioned itself across the commissary table from him, not at Ruiz's tablet, at Villanueva's. He went very still. The creature looked at his tablet, at the frequency mapping display, at the analysis he was running, then it made a sound. Short, structured, 3 distinct tonal elements. He had no idea what it meant. He played it back on the frequency visualizer anyway, showing the creature the waveform representation of what it had just said. The creature made the sound again, pointed. There was no other word for the gesture, though the appendage it used was not a finger, at a specific section of the waveform. He zoomed in on that section. The creature made a different sound, 3 tones again, but different. And it pointed to the same section of the waveform. He stared at the display. The 2 waveforms were in the same range, but with different internal architecture. Like the difference between a question and an answer. Like the same word spoken 2 ways that changed the meaning. He said out loud to no one, "Oh." Then he woke Ruiz up, because Ruiz needed to see this. Castellano sat at the adjacent table and worked on her own analysis, cross-referencing the signal patterns with the behavioral observations she'd been accumulating since the first hours on Station 7. She was a different kind of thinker from Ruiz, less patient, more intuitive, with a habit of pacing when she was processing information that she'd apparently been repressing for hours, because when Villanueva pointed her toward an open area of the commissary floor, she paced 7 times across it in rapid succession before returning and saying, "I think I know what they want." He looked up from his tablet. "The infrastructure examination," she said. "The equipment in the reclamation bay, the data panels. They've been in 17 stations. They've been in every area of infrastructure. Life support, communications, power generation, water, food systems." She spread her hands. "They're cataloging. They're assessing whether these stations are viable long-term habitations. For who?" She looked at him. "I don't know. For who? For us. For them. For some third party we don't know about yet. But the assessment is the point, not the disruption. They've never cut power. They've never contaminated water. They've never damaged anything. They've been in 17 colonial stations for 40 hours, and they haven't broken a single thing. Except terrifying 41,000 people," he said. "Yes, and they may not know that. They may not have a concept of." She stopped. "No, that's not right. They do know. Station 14, this room." She nodded at the commissary. "Whatever is happening here. They know the people were afraid, and they're trying to address it, and they're doing it the only way they know how." She paused again. "They just don't have words yet." He thought about the thing that had watched him leave Station 7, adjusting its angle, getting a better look. He thought about the child's drawing, carefully replaced on the wall. He thought about the coffee mug, turned in what might have been hands put gently back down. "Where are the 312, he asked. Castellano was quiet. From across the commissary, Ruiz sat up suddenly, pushed his hair out of his face and said, "I've got something." What Ruiz had was not a translation. It was something earlier and rougher than that. A partial mapping between 2 of the repeated signal patterns and 2 of the repeated sound patterns. Enough to suggest that the creatures were using a communication system with consistent structural rules, and enough to construct 2 very basic, very uncertain exchanges. The first exchange, repeated multiple times in the last 3 hours of observation, appeared to mean something in the vicinity of "this place?" question. The second was harder to pin down, and Ruiz had 3 different interpretations of it, and he walked them through all 3 carefully and admitted he wasn't sure which was right. The first interpretation, brought here, safe. The second, taken, protected. The third, which Ruiz delivered with the particular tentativeness of someone who knows they're on thin analytical ice. "This place, better than the other place." Villanueva looked at the 3 interpretations for a long time. Then he looked at Castellano. "Other place," she said quietly. "Yeah, where they came from." "Yeah." He thought about a species that examined infrastructure before they communicated, that assessed the viability of habitation, that came from somewhere they might have described as not better, that had been broadcasting signal patterns on external arrays for 40 hours, not to disrupt, not to threaten, but because they were trying to talk and hadn't figured out how yet. He thought about how long it must have taken them to get here, how far they might have traveled, what they might have left behind. He thought about the word plea, which was in the first distress signal they'd received. "Please," someone responded. He reached across the table and typed a sequence of frequency patterns, the ones that corresponded, as best they could determine, to something like "this place," question, and amplified them through the commissary's PA system. The response was immediate. Every creature in the commissary turned toward the PA speaker. 7 pairs of visual organs, eyes was not quite the right word, but close enough focused on the PA with an intensity that was not threatening and not aggressive, but was very, very present. The elderly man in his coffee machine tutorial paused. Ruiz held his breath. The children, who had been murmuring to each other, went quiet. One of them made a sound. Ruiz's mapping software caught it and highlighted two matched patterns. Ruiz looked at the screen, looked at Villanueva, looked back at the screen. "I think," he said very carefully, "that they're saying yes." The 312 colonists from Station 7 were on the creature's ship. It was not a ship in the conventional sense, not a hull and engine and navigation system that a human engineer would recognize. But it was a vessel, parked in a stable orbit on the dark side of Kepler's moon, accessible via a transit that the creatures had apparently been using to move between the moon and the 17 stations. This information came through with great difficulty, and over the course of 2 more hours and 3 additional, people joining the translation effort, as a series of exchanges that left everyone involved uncertain about 90% of the nuance, but reasonably confident about the core facts. The colonists were alive, unharmed. They had been taken, and here the translation was especially uncertain. Not as prisoners, not as cargo, but as something closer to guests, or maybe witnesses, or maybe both. The creatures had wanted to show them something. The creatures had apparently determined, based on their infrastructure assessments, that some of the colonial stations were facing long-term viability problems. Systems degrading, life support margins too thin, populations too isolated to sustain themselves over a multi-generational span. They had come to say something about that. They had not known how. Ruiz, at hour 13 of the translation effort, managed to construct a question, imprecise, clumsy, probably missing entire layers of meaning, that amounted to why these stations. The response came in pieces, over the next 20 minutes, assembled by 4 people working simultaneously on the frequency mapping. Villanueva took notes the entire time, because he had started taking notes and he was not going to stop now, and also because someone needed to produce a record of this for every governing body and emergency session and committee that would spend the next several years trying to understand what had happened in the Kepler band on a Tuesday. The answer, assembled from fragments and inferences and a translation that was still 90% guesswork, was this: because we went to the other place. And we saw what happened when the place failed, and there was no one to say so. Villanueva sat with that for a long time. He thought about a species that had traveled 300 light years. It would turn out to be 317 when the distance was finally properly measured, to knock on the doors of strangers because they had seen, in some other system, what happened when inhabited places deteriorated past the point of recovery and nobody had known to warn anyone. He thought about what kind of loss that would have to be to motivate the journey. What kind of care underneath the loss? He thought about 41 people on 3 shuttles who had gotten moving because a voice on a recording said please. He didn't say any of this out loud. He wrote it down. The 312 colonists from Station 7 were transferred back in the early hours of the following day. They came through the transit in groups, escorted, there was no better word, though it had taken on a different meaning, by 2 of the creatures per group, and they arrived at Station 7's main airlock with the stunned, specific expression of people who had seen something that would take a long time to process, and were beginning the very first stage of that processing now. Some of them, Villanueva noticed, were carrying things, small things, a data chip, a folded piece of material that might have been fabric of a kind he didn't recognize. Objects that had been given to them, apparently, during whatever the time on the vessel had been. Some held these things carefully. The way you hold something you aren't sure is fragile until you know more about it. Some held them the way you hold a gift from someone who has shown you a kindness in circumstances that made kindness unexpected. Director Castellano was at the airlock. When the first group came through, she counted them with her eyes, the same way Villanueva had counted them through the maintenance port hatch. And when she got to the end of the group and the number was right, she put one hand briefly over her face and then took it away and started directing traffic. He stood beside her for a moment. 312, he said. 312, she confirmed. Her voice was steady. I'm going to stop being surprised by you, he said. She looked at him with an expression that might have been amusement, if amusement could coexist with that level of exhaustion. Don't, she said. The surprise is the best part. The formal response from the Federated Worlds Council and the other governing bodies came 44 hours after the first distress signal. It was, as these things tend to be, a carefully worded statement acknowledging the situation, assigning committee authority to investigate, and outlining a process for determining appropriate next steps. Reyes read it aloud to the crew of Proxima Relay Station in the loading bay, where 218 colonists were still sleeping on cots. She read it with a completely expressionless face. When she finished, she folded her tablet, set it down, and said, "Good, they can take it from here." A pause. "But they should know," she added, "that we already did the interesting part." Nobody laughed, but people were smiling, and that was enough. 3 months later, the first real translation dictionary was 43 pages long, still riddled with gaps and uncertainties, and had been produced by a team that now included Ruiz, a xenolinguist from the university at New Cartagena who had abandoned a sabbatical project to come work on it, and two of the creatures who had apparently decided to stay in the Kepler band rather than return to wherever they had come from. They were, as far as the dictionary team could determine, the equivalent of scholars or archivists. The ones who had been running the external array broadcasting program, who had spent 40 hours trying every frequency protocol in an enormous library to find something that worked. They seemed to find the dictionary project congenial, which was perhaps the single most interesting piece of xenobiological information yet produced. That the entities who had terrified 41,000 people across 17 stations were at their core researchers who had a communication problem. What the dictionary could not yet capture, what Villanueva suspected might take years or decades to capture, if it was capturable at all, was the full context of what the creatures had come to say. But the outline was there, assembled from 3 months of painstaking exchange and cross-reference. They were called, in their own communication system, something that rendered into human phonemes as the Vesh, though Ruiz admitted with scholarly honesty that the rendering was approximate. They had been spacefaring for a very long time. They had a practice, old, cultural, evidently important, of what the dictionary team was calling infrastructure scouting, sending advanced teams to assess the viability of inhabited systems because they had, in their history, seen what happened to isolated populations when the systems supporting them failed without warning. They had developed the practice after a loss. The dictionary couldn't yet translate how large a loss, but the emotional register of the exchanges on the subject was, apparently, significant enough that the xenolinguist from New Cartagena had started to use the word grief, with a caveat in her notes. They had come to the Kepler band not to conquer it, not to take it. They had come because their instruments had detected 17 stations in configurations they recognized as precarious, life support margins, power generation degradation, population isolation indices, and they had wanted to tell someone. They had not had words for it. They had tried to broadcast. They had examined the infrastructure carefully, as they always did, because understanding the problem was prerequisite to explaining it. They had taken 312 colonists to their vessel to show them what the assessments indicated and what could be done, because they hadn't yet found another way to communicate it. And then a relay station with 3 shuttles and 41 ordinary people had shown up and started moving 218 scared colonists through maintenance tunnels. And a 23-year-old communications engineer had started playing their signals back at them. And a maintenance technician had held out a nutrition bar. In this, Villanueva thought, they were not entirely unlike the people who had responded to the distress signals when no governing body would. They had come a very long way, with very limited communication tools, to say something that was important to say. The fact that the arrival had been terrifying and the communication had taken 2 days and 43 pages of imperfect translation to begin to work did not change the fundamental character of the attempt. He wrote that down too. In the same document where he'd been writing observations since the first shuttle ride, which was now long enough to constitute something between a journal and a record and a testimony. The first distress beacon came through on a Tuesday. He wrote at the beginning of the final entry, "We were not equipped for it. We were not authorized for it. We were not soldiers or diplomats or xenobiologists. We were the people who were close enough and willing enough and stubborn enough to go, and it turns out that close and willing and stubborn are sometimes the credentials that matter." He paused, added, "The Vesh came 317 light years to say that people were in danger. They didn't have the words. They came anyway. We went into stations full of things we'd never seen, things that should have been beyond our understanding, things that by any rational measure we had no business engaging with. We went anyway. I don't know what to call that quality. I'm not sure it has a name, but it's the same thing, I think, on their side and ours. Something that says the distance is not a reason not to try." He paused again, thought about the 8-year-old girl with the stuffed animal she'd treated like a useful tool, about the elderly man and the coffee machine, about Esperanza and her cable ties and her bad attitude, which had gotten 218 people through a maintenance tunnel in 2 minutes flat. About Castellano with her medical tape and her 200 hours of broadcast into silence, and the strip of tape still holding her hair back on the shuttle home because she hadn't stopped long enough to replace it. About the Vesh, crossing a darkness that took 317 light years to traverse, to knock on a door and say, in the only language they had at the time, this place, question. About what it meant that both of them, the knockers and the ones who opened the door, had been doing essentially the same thing, acting on a belief that the distance was not a reason not to try, that the gap between unknown and known could be crossed if you were willing to start crossing it, that 41,000 people, or 312 colonists, or one human, or one species at the end of a very long journey, were worth showing up for. The machine doesn't run without maintenance, he wrote finally. You have to show up with the tools you have and fix what you can fix and come back when you can't fix it yet. He closed the document. 6 months after the first distress beacon, a formal joint session of the Federated Worlds Council and the Vesh. It was not called that officially, because the official language took another 8 months to catch up with what had already happened, produced a statement of intent that was 27 pages long and covered provisional communication protocols, shared infrastructure assessment frameworks, and what was diplomatically termed a mutual exploration framework for inhabited space. Villanueva was not at that session. He was at Proxima Relay Station, fixing the recycler unit on Deck 7 that he'd been elbow-deep in when the alarm first chimed. It had been broken for 7 months now because every time he got close to finishing it, something else came up. He was working on the coupling interface, which had been the original problem and was still the original problem, because the universe did not stop having broken recycler units just because you'd been involved in first contact with an alien civilization. He was working on the coupling interface when his tablet chimed. A message from Castellano, now operating as interim liaison director between the Kepler band stations and the Vesh. It was one line. They asked about you specifically, the one from Station 7, at the maintenance port. He stared at the message for a while. Then he typed back, what did it ask? The response came 3 minutes later. It asked if the one with the offering is still here. I told them yes. They seemed to understand that word fine. They said, good. He looked at the message. Then he put the tablet in his pocket and went back to the coupling interface and worked on it for another 20 minutes until it was fixed. Because the recycler unit needed to run properly, and someone had to fix it, and that had always been enough reason. The station hummed around him. The hum his mother had hummed while she worked, that he'd inherited without deciding to, that had been in his throat in the dark corridor of Station 7, when a creature made of overlapping chitin plates and 40 hours of failed communication attempts had stood 40 meters away and not moved. That hum was in him now, low and tuneless and rhythmic, the sound of a person doing the work in front of them because it was in front of them, and it needed doing. Transit space was gray and full of nothing visible. Somewhere in it, vessels were moving, human vessels and vessels that weren't human, and the dictionary team and Ruiz, who was on his 3rd notebook of frequency mappings and had taken to carrying a recorder everywhere he went, and the 2 Vesh scholars who had chosen to stay, whom the colonists of Station 14 had named, with the practical affection of people who have coexisted with something long enough to stop being afraid of it, the 2. And somewhere, 317 light years out, a direction that would have a human name for it soon, there were more of them. Coming, perhaps, or waiting to see how this went. Or both. He picked up the next tool. He kept working. The machine doesn't run without maintenance. The distance is not a reason not to try. And sometimes the person closest to the problem, with the simplest tools and the most ordinary reasons, is exactly the person who needs to be there.